The arsenal of democracy. As America mobilized for World War II, we unleashed a wave of military production unlike anything the world had ever seen. Nearly 200,000 artillery pieces, nearly 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks. At the height of the effort, we were producing a new B-24 Liberator, a long-range bomber with more than 1.5 million parts, every 63 minutes. That was the America of 80 years ago. So, what could we accomplish if the even wealthier, even more technologically advanced America of today was faced with a similar challenge? Well, a lot less than you'd think. Look, we don't mean to be boastful, but there are some things America is really, really good at. We've got a disproportionate amount of the world's biggest companies. We've got the most elite universities on the planet. We lead the world in the production of tiny pop stars that seem like a cartoon mouse came to life. And one area where we definitely excel is the armed forces. The United States is ranked as the world's preeminent military power. Moreover, it's beloved. Polling shows that we trust the military more than almost any other institution in American life. And here's the thing. When an institution is both that successful and that popular, we often take its success for granted. And these days, we definitely shouldn't be taking the military's success for granted. Don't get us wrong, there's no fighting force you'd rather have on your side than the men and women of the US military. But when it comes to the huge bureaucratic infrastructure that supports them, well, the Pentagon starts to look a lot more like other government agencies. One of the areas where this is most pronounced is in military procurement, the process by which we actually develop the weaponry and technology we send into the field. And how should we put this? If the US military as it performs in the field is this, then the procurement process is this. The headlines tell the story. On average, major Defense Department programs take over 10 years before they yield any usable weaponry. As of 2025, plans to upgrade the electronic systems on the F-35 fighter jet were running more than 5 years behind schedule and more than $6 billion over budget. The Navy's production of new ships is at its lowest level in 25 years, at a time when China has already surpassed us in total number of naval vessels. How does this happen? There are a lot of answers to that question. One big problem is finding enough people to actually do the work. Back in the days of the arsenal of democracy, military production was about steel and rivets. Today, it's increasingly about silicon and microchips. That requires a skilled labor force. And because defense companies can't scale up their operations without long-term commitments from the Pentagon, and because Washington is a town that's so focused on the short term that often doesn't happen, there are chronic worker shortages as a result. Another big problem is that the military brass don't always know what they want. In many cases, that leads to military vehicles constantly being redesigned during production at a cost of lots of time and money to give them more and more features. And oftentimes, those features don't go together. A particularly painful example of this is the Navy's effort to produce Littoral Combat Ships, or LCSs, vessels that are meant for warfare near the shore. This process, which began in the early 2000s, envisioned a ship that could hunt submarines, and clear mines, and fight other warships. Basically, you can think of this as how a toddler might build a military. What came out of the other end of that process? A vessel that wasn't good at any of those tasks. Hunting submarines? It turned out the LCS's sonar didn't work properly, and that the vessel was too loud. So the Navy scrapped that function entirely. Mine hunting? The ship's mine detection system turned out to be prone to false alarms, and frequently broke down altogether. Fighting other warships? It turned out the LCS didn't have protections against the flooding of critical systems if the ship was under attack, a shortcoming that led Pentagon analysts to say that the design, quote, accepts the risk that the crew would have to abandon ship. Which, seems like a design flaw. The result? In 2023, the military announced that a number of the vessels would be retired 4 years into what was supposed to be a 25-year run. Now, you'd think that someone would have pulled the plug somewhere earlier in the process, but the culture of the military can keep these mistakes from being pointed out. One former admiral admitted that he wished he had raised objections about the LCS earlier, but as a subordinate naval officer, when your boss tells you, here's a shovel, go dig the hole, you go dig the hole. And these kinds of problems aren't unique to hardware, as we can see with the case of the Pentagon project that spent an estimated $5 billion on new camouflage patterns, only to discover that the patterns actually made troops easier to see. But there's one other factor that goes beyond the walls of the Pentagon. Too often, Congress treats these kinds of big defense projects as jobs programs, even if the jobs aren't producing anything useful for the military. That's what happened when the retirement of those LCSs was announced. Even though they had basically become white elephants, those vessels were big business for the firms with contracts to supply and repair them. Contracts with an estimated value of up to $3 billion. And advocates claimed that retiring them would cost thousands of jobs. The result? Congress backpedaled and only retired 4 of the ships when the original plans had been to retire 9. And this was far from the first time this had happened. Something similar occurred in the 1980s when members of Congress tried to reduce funding for the B-2 bomber. Why would anyone want to cut funding for something that looks this awesome? Well, because looking awesome is most of its job description. The B-2's nickname is the Hangar Queen, because for every hour it spends in the air, it spends 51 hours on the ground in maintenance, which might be a small price to pay for its impact in the field, but about that, the B-2 has made more appearances over air shows and sporting events than it ever has above active battlefields. Nevertheless, those funding cuts never happened. Why? Because work on the B-2 was spread out over 46 different states and nearly 90% of the country's 435 congressional districts, meaning almost every member of Congress could say that the cuts would cost jobs in their districts. And look, while bureaucratic delays and costs to the taxpayer are big problems, perhaps the single biggest issue here is that all of this results in a military that's less nimble. In an age when new and deadly technologies like drones can be unleashed at lightning speed, scholars are warning that these kinds of delays come at a steep cost. As one longtime defense analyst cautioned, taking 12 years to develop new weapons is, quote, a time frame incompatible with emerging threats and the rate of technological change. Which, in Washington, is how they say, hey guys, maybe start panicking? All of which means that the best time to get serious about this was yesterday, and the second best time is now. Because Americans still have the spirit of the arsenal of democracy within us. We just need institutions that unleash it. In other words, a little more this and a little less this.